Welcome back to Home Built Workshop, and this is episode number 2 of my Great Guitar Build-Off series for 2021. Today, it's neck day. Let's do this. So just a few quick details on the neck before we jump in and make some sawdust. We're going to use hard rock maple to build the neck. We're going to have a rosewood fretboard. We're going to have carbon fiber strengthening rods, as well as a 2-way truss rod and a 25.5-inch scale length. Enough of that yapping, let's start cutting.
After cutting the piece to length, I'm going to use double-sided tape to attach the template to the board. And then, like always, I like to trace around my template with a pencil. The pencil line gives me a little bit more of a line to follow when I'm cutting at the bandsaw. And since my template is already attached to the blank, it's really easy to jump right to the router table. I'm going to pay very careful attention of grain direction while I'm routing this flush. Remember to always cut with the grain. Don't go against it or you risk really bad tear out. Ask me how I know that. To make sure I'm always cutting with the grain, some of the cuts will be using the top bearing on my router bit, other cuts will be using the bottom bearing on the router bit. And the last thing that I'm going to do before I remove the template is to drill small pilot holes for the tuner locations. The drill bit's not quite long enough to go all the way through, but I just need a pilot hole to mark the location.
Now I'll just pop this template off of here. We are done with that. Up until now, this material is a little bit thick. I need to be about 3/4 of an inch with a 1/4 inch fretboard for a final neck thickness of 1 inch. This is a little too thick right now, so we're gonna pass it through the drum sander just a couple times, just to remove a little bit of that material. Otherwise, we're gonna be carving it all away later. I'd rather get rid of it now. So now I need to mark out a few different lines on the neck. One of them will be a center line running all the way from one end to the other. I'm going to use this for routing the truss rod channel as well as for alignment purposes when we glue on the fretboard. The other 2 lines are going to be offset just a little bit from the truss rod channel, and these are going to be the locations where we're going to route an 1/8 inch channel for some carbon fiber reinforcing rods. I've got a little block that has little guide holes here that help me drill the holes for the truss rod in the right spot.
I just line this block up with the center line of the neck and clamp it in place.
Now I'll just drill a shallow hole in the end of the neck, and that's where the truss rod adjustment will stick out. I've got a little tape flag on my drill bit so I don't go too far. The depth isn't super important because most of that's going to get routed away anyway, but I don't want to go farther than I have to. Now ideally, I'd like to be able to put this in my drill press to drill it nice and straight and square. I really can't do that on my drill press because my drill press is a smaller model and there's just not enough room. So for now, it's by hand. The next hole though, we'll be able to finish at the drill press. I'm gonna start it by hand just to get the mark, and then we'll move it over to the drill press. Once we know where it needs to be, we can remove the jig and drill it nice and straight and square. There we have just a little mark. It's gonna be perfect to line it back up at the drill press. One little trick that I use when I have a center mark to line it up with something like a Forstner bit or a brad point drill bit, bring your piece up to the drill bit, line up that point, and then bring your quill down, which will align it perfectly. A lot of times that's easier than trying to wiggle the piece around until you get it in alignment. Bring the piece up, line it up, you're good. Now all we need to do is route the truss rod channel. I've got a scrap of the same plywood that my jig is made out of. I use that to set my depth. So I'll just place it over the router bit and I can see how much is sticking out, and that's how much is going to be making the cut. I'm going to do this in several passes, adjusting this until I get to the thickness of the truss rod. Making small cuts, take my time. I'm also using a spiral down cutting bit. 1/4 inch bit, straight cutting, works really well. fits like a glove.
Now I'll just stick that same router jig back on my lines that I marked out for the carbon fiber rods. And I'll route those channels using the same process, just using an 1/8 inch straight cutting bit.
So there we have the truss rod channel as well as the channels for the carbon fiber rods. We are ready to move on and start making a fretboard. I've got this cool piece of rosewood. I think it's going to make awesome fretboards. First, it's a little bit wide. I'm going to trim a little excess off, that way we can save that piece for something down the road. Then we can resaw it and get it ready to cut some fret slots. Well, now it's time to dust off the old fret slotting jig. I like to screw mine down to the table. Keeps it nice and stable and sturdy. We use our good old trusty double-sided tape to stick our fretboard blank down to the template and start making some sawdust. We'll get this thing loaded up in the jig. Clamp it down. I have added these little clamps to my jig. They don't come with that, but it makes it so much quicker when you're using a jig like this. You can make your cut, release it, move it over, lock it back down. It's way faster than the little thumb screws. I still have to use these once in a while at the beginning and the end of the fretboard, like right now. This end of the fretboard, since it's really long, I'm going to be cutting that off. There's no jig underneath it, so I don't want to clamp it down because it could cause it to bow. So I'm still going to have to use the original included thumb wheel dealio. Technical term. Once we get to where the jig is underneath everything, we can use those toggle clamps and it makes it way faster.
Now I can cut the fretboard to its final length. Now I'll mark out a quick center line on the fretboard to help me align it with the center line of the neck. And to keep it in alignment, I'm going to drill a couple of small holes, one of them through the nut slot and the other one through the very last fret slot. These will be to hold some small nails. Don't worry, I was focused on this step even if the camera wasn't. Before I apply any glue, I'm going to clamp the fretboard exactly where I want it. From here I can put brad nails down through those tiny holes and lightly tap them to mark the location on the neck. This will keep the fretboard from slipping around when we glue it in place. Now it's time to drop in the truss rod. I'll add some wood glue to the slots for the rods as well as the top of the neck. We'll insert the rods. I tap them to make sure they're seated fully. And we'll top all that off with our fretboard. I tap the nails to make sure they're seated in the holes we made earlier. And then we'll just clamp this sucker down.
If you're ever wondering how many clamps is enough, all of them. Let's let this dry.
With the glue dried, it's back to the bandsaw to trim off the excess fretboard material so that we can route it flush on the router table.
So now we need to remove some thickness from the headstock. We need to get it down around 5/8 of an inch so that it works with our tuners. To do that, we're going to use this super high-tech marking device. This super high-tech device is just a block of wood with a hole drilled in it for a mechanical pencil. The spacing right here is just over 5/8 of an inch. So what we can do, place it flat on our work table and just scribe a line all the way around. And that's going to give us a line we can cut at the bandsaw to remove the bulk of the material. I don't want to have to sand this much away. it's little gadgets like this that save us a lot of time in the long run. I'm always on the lookout for some sort of gadget like this that I can make that's going to help me with a repeated task in the future.
Once I've carefully sliced away the bulk of the material, I'm going to use this little jig for my oscillating spindle sander to help me flatten everything out and create a nice transition at the end of the fretboard.
And there we go. This jig works really well. It makes a nice smooth transition. We have just a little bit of cleanup sanding to do to remove some of the grooves left by the sanding drum, but overall, this jig works really great. Now, onto another jig to route this little recess here where the logo goes in the headstock. This wonky jig right here is going to allow me to route a little relief here. Those of you that are familiar with my headstock design know that there's a little relief cut in here, and then in that relief is where I put my logo. But this jig is going to allow me to do that. It's made to hold a guitar neck, either a lefty or a righty, in the same spot. And then I have this little guide that the router will follow along here and allow me to cut that relief quickly and simply. One thing that's very important to me when I'm building jigs, especially something for a very specific task, I try to make it work for both left-handed and right-handed setups all in the same jig. I don't want to have a bunch of different jigs depending on if I'm building a lefty or a righty. I am a lefty, so it's very important that I can build both kinds because, well, I think if you're a lefty, you already know that when it comes to guitar shops, you are left with very minimal choices. You don't get all of the cool options, and really you almost always only get the color black. And I don't think that's right. So in my best efforts to try to accommodate both, I try to make that work into my jigs. Sometimes it takes a little bit of extra work in figuring and trying to figure out how to make it work that way, but that's a really important thing to me.
I make sure to add the brand now before I remove the neck from the jig. That way if there's any issue, I can just go back with the router, take it down a little bit more, and rebrand it.
Nice.
Now we're back at the drill press to drill some fretboard markers at the 12th fret. I'm going to glue in some homemade maple dowels for the markers. Once the glue's dry, I'll use a flush trim saw to cut the markers off nice and flush. Then we'll begin arm day here at Home Built Workshop by sanding the fretboard radius. I'm going to start out with 80 grit to remove the bulk of the material, making sure to stop periodically to clean both the fret slots as well as the sandpaper. I'm going to stop at 800 grit and use my fret saw to clean out the fret slots as well as deepen them from any material that we've sanded down. And then my last pass will just be a light sanding with 1000 grit. It's time to put some frets in this thing. I'll first pre-bend my fret wire. I'll double check that I've overbent it just a little bit, and then I'll cut the fret wire to size.
Bam!
I almost forgot to drill the tuner holes. I like to do this typically before I radius the fretboard, but just using a block under the headstock keeps it nice and level. And now back to the frets. I had to remove them to drill the tuner holes, so now I'll just lightly tap them back in their place. I'll use this arbor press to press in the frets from there. Once I get them all pressed in, I go back around and give each one another quick press. This helps me make sure that I've got everything seated properly. Also notice the gloves here? I always seem to get sliced up when I'm pressing in frets. The ends are so sharp. Next I'll use my belt grinder to sand the edges of the frets almost flush to the edge of the neck. This saves me a ton of time in the next step, which is using a file mounted at 90 degrees in a block of wood to flush the edges of the frets to the fretboard. Then I'll switch to a block with the file mounted at an angle to file the bevel on the edge of the frets. As soon as the glue's dry on the markers, I'll just trim them nice and flush, and then we're finally on to shaping the neck.
And yes, that does mean we are breaking out the neck shaping jig. Those of you that have been following the channel for a little while, you guys have seen me build this. You've seen me make a round of improvements and some modifications to it. And honestly, that process is not yet complete. I actually want to be making a whole new carriage for this, one that will accommodate a neck with frets and everything. I'd like to save this step for the very last. And right now, it's not currently built to accommodate the extra thickness of the frets. I need to change some dimensions, and really I just need to remake a whole carriage. But for now, we're gonna hog off some of the bulk of the material using this. It's gonna be just fine, and then we'll fine tune it, bring the shape in by hand.
And now for arm workout number 2 of this project, we're going to finish shaping the neck using files, rasps, and a whole lot of sanding. I usually start out with the good old Shinto rasp. It removes material really fast, and it works really well for this operation. It's really important to stop often during this process and make careful measurements of the thickness of your neck. And I have just a little bit to go.
Well, my arms are tired. That's a good thing, because that means we've done something today. I think now our neck is ready to stop where we are. We still got a bunch of sanding to do, but we can do that later on when we're getting ready for the finish. The very last thing that I want to do is get this attached to the body. So I need to drill a couple of holes in the back of the body to accept the neck ferrules, and then we can screw this thing down, make sure everything fits good, and wrap this up.
I use this little block that's the same size as the heel of my neck. It has pilot holes that I can use at the drill press to drill the holes in the right spot. The drill bit doesn't reach all the way through the body, but that's okay. It gives me a pilot hole where I can then remove the block and finish drilling all the way through to the back. And then I can flip the body over and switch to a 15mm Forstner bit. Then I'll just drill the shallow recesses to accept the neck ferrules. And lastly, I'll enlarge those pilot holes to a size that better fits the screws for the neck.
So now I'll install the grommets and lightly get the screws started. Now we'll install the neck. And now I'm going to ever so slightly run the screws in until they just touch the neck. A word of caution, do not use a drill to tighten your neck bolts. I'm only using the drill to run the screws in to touch the back of the neck, acting like a center punch.
With the hole locations marked, I'll just drill pilot holes at the drill press. Now we can reinstall the neck, and I like to clamp it in place.
You gotta use the obligatory Harbor Freight clamp, right? You can't build a guitar without one. I clamp the neck in place, that way it's nice and bottomed out in the neck pocket. I don't have to worry about it moving around, and it's like a convenient kickstand. Let's remove the clamp and take a look at our Dorian. Bam! Ooh, look at that, I like it. I think that's gonna wrap up episode number 2 of the Great Guitar Build-Off series. Our neck is ready to go. I've got a mess here in the shop to clean up, and then if anybody needs me for the next several days, I'm gonna be sanding. I'm gonna do a bunch of that sanding before we jump into episode number 3, which hopefully we'll be getting some finish on these parts here. So make sure you stick around to catch all the episodes, as well as all the other great guitar build-off episodes from all of the other contestants. There's a ton of them out there. Make sure you check them out. Thanks a lot for watching, guys. We'll see you next time. And of course, I hear the obligatory siren coming our way right when we're ready to start doing something. Always. Come on, people. Drive safer. Don't fret over this step.